The Falcons are looking to find their answer at quarterback very soon, and all signs point to Kirk Cousins.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. And guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at FalFans.com, RIP, but you may also know me as Sirius Black. You may also know me as Mr. Drew. You may also know me as the Jolly Green Giant, and of course, you may also know me as Mr. AKA. And of course, I appreciate each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast that makes it your first watch or first listen of the day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are joined by Daniel Flick, who covers the Falcons for Fan Nation, part of the SI Media Group. We'll talk about free agency, draft, who Daniel likes, and both. Is Jayden Daniels the Falcons' top trade-up target? But of course, we got to start the conversation with the current quarterback search and get Daniel's brain on whether or not he's buying into the Kirk Cousins smoke that is ongoing. And we'll start that conversation right now. All right, everyone, we are back with an illustrious guest. He is Daniel Flick, who covers the Falcons for Fan Nation, part of the SI Media Group. And of course, we're talking about the big, illustrious offseason and what their plans are for the Atlanta Falcons this offseason. So, Daniel, my friend, welcome back to Locked On Falcons.
Man, I'm happy to be here. It's been a little while. But last time I was on, I think I got my predictions right, and hopefully we'll run it back.
Yeah, we'll get into it. Yeah, you accurately, about 3 weeks out of free agency, I think last year, predicted them getting Jesse Bates. So we'll see if we can pick your brain on some take your bold predictions for free agency a little bit later in the episode. But let's start with the topic of the month, which is who's the next quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons going to be. And I'm curious, Daniel, from your perspective, given all the sort of push and pull with Justin Fields versus Kirk Cousins, and now there's the Russell Wilson contingent is emerging. I'm just curious, where do you see the Falcons going in terms of their quarterback?
I think it ends up being a veteran option. I think for now that's a pretty heavy favorite. That's where a lot of the buzz is around the league, is like, hey, it's going to be somebody that's already started the game in the NFL. I tend to think the Kirk Cousins stuff is real. From what I know, from what a lot of people that I trust know, it feels like there's a lot of talk about Kirk that's valid, and you see a lot of smoke this time of year, but I don't think that's smoke. I think that's pretty real. I think it really, since he's going to be on the open market, I think it really becomes a bidding war. I think Atlanta throws a lot of money at him. I've been wrestling back and forth on it a little bit. If I had to put a favorite on it, I think Kirk Cousins is currently the betting favorite for it. And like my personal mind, like the sports book going in my head right now, Kirk Cousins is the favorite at probably like a plus 120. Like it's I wouldn't say is, in the like he's like a minus 200 or something like that. Yeah. It's not anything massive, but I think that with where the buzz is shifting, if you would have asked me a month ago, I would have said there was a very real shot that Fields was kind of in that favorite mix. I think he's much more of a secondary option now, kind of like a fallback for him. I tend to think Cousins right now is the guy that they really want to go after. And I think that they're ultimately right now with where they're at, that's really what they're pushing for.
Yeah, that makes sense. Been talking about that for the last several weeks here on this podcast. Obviously, the biggest challenge for the Falcons landing Cousins is going to be him staying in Minnesota. And there's a real possibility that he could stay in Minnesota. And I think that's one of the reasons why you can't put the odds at minus 200, because, coin flip, 40% chance, 60% chance, whatever you want to put the odds on that, him and Minnesota come to a accord. And, from all accounts, it sounds like he wants to stay there. But obviously, if the questions with that are surrounding, I think, the number of years guaranteed, with Kirk Cousins, and they seem to be wanting to sort of build an off ramp to Kirk Cousins and not commit long term to him. And the Falcons are like, hey man, we'll build the whole road for you, potentially here, because we just need someone competent in the building. So we'll see if the Falcons do that. But I think you're right. If Cousins does find a way to stay in Minnesota, do you think that becomes Justin Fields becomes the favorite to be the pivot at that point in time?
I think with where it's at with Chicago, we've kind of had this talk a lot this offseason about the lack of leverage there. And you continue to see reports come out about Chicago not really having much of a market or a lot of interested teams in trying to land Fields, which I think kind of shifts some leverage to Atlanta on that front. I do think Atlanta and Chicago met in Indianapolis. Like there has been talks there. We know this. We know there's been discussions. We know that they've been at least talked about the subject. I tend to think that this is a situation where if Atlanta can't land Cousins, you start to see it kind of look more at trying to extend that conversation, maybe like a few more weeks to where they can start having that talk about, hey, what would it take to move up in the draft? Hey, there's been reports about New England potentially wanting to move down. Would Atlanta be interested in that? I tend to think if the opportunity presents itself, yes. I don't think Atlanta's going to cheap out of this. I think it's going to take the approach of like, hey, this is what we need. We know that's what we need. We will not stop this offseason. We will not settle this offseason. What we want is what we're going to try to, land. And so I think you're going to end up seeing where they end up, if they can't, I don't think it's going to be like Cousins 1A, Fields 1B. I don't think it's that type of boat. I think they're going to, if they can't land Cousins, you'll start to see them look at more of those draft options. I think Jayden Daniels is the guy that they would want in that situation. Would they have the chance to get him? Does not look overly likely. But again, that's also kind of still playing itself out. So in the hypothetical that they don't land Cousins, I think you see them wait a couple more weeks. You see them have some more talks with Chicago. You see them have some more talks with teams trying to trade up. And then you kind of see that play out. But I do think at that point it would become more of it's Fields versus a potential guy in the draft rather than all the Russell Wilson stuff. I don't really lean too much into. But yeah, so it would then, for me, your top two options at that point are Fields and whoever's in the draft. And so I think that'd probably take another 2 to 3 weeks to kind of thoroughly vet out their options.
Well, last tidbit on the quarterback, at least free agent conversation. Maybe we'll circle back to talking maybe about Jayden Daniels and others. But what are your thoughts on the sort of Baker Mayfield rumors? Or are you dismissing that? Because I think a lot of people, like myself included, are like, he's probably going back to Tampa, so I don't need to waste too much brain cells on that. But is there a pathway for Baker Mayfield to be the next Falcons quarterback in your eyes?
There is a pathway, but again, I'm in the same boat as you. I don't really think it happens. I don't think he gets out of Tampa Bay. I think there's a much higher likelihood that Cousins gets out of Minnesota than you see Mayfield leave Tampa Bay. I haven't really put much brain thought into that because I don't think he leaves Tampa. It's kind of as simple as that for me. I think there's, you kind of think about the way that he played last year, what he brings to an organization, but then you start weighing the contract and what he did the few years prior to this past year. And I don't really think that's the type of splash, the type of move Atlanta's trying to win, trying to hit. For me, when you look at the quarterback situation, I've always kind of thought Fields was kind of that not so happy medium of we're going to pay big money to a Kirk Cousins, to a guy who's proven he can pass for 4,500 yards, throw the ball at a high level, or we're going to go out and draft a young quarterback and hope that they can become that type of guy. I've always thought that Fields and Mayfield kind of are in that intermediate tier where it's like, we kind of know what they are. We've seen them at their peak. We're going to hope that we can help them play at that peak for a full 17 games. If again, for me, when you're so committed, as Atlanta said, that it is trying to solve this really big quarterback question mark, I don't think that's the option they would have their eyes on. I also don't think it's an issue that they'll end up having to face because I don't think it ends up reaching a point where he's seriously in contention to leave Tampa Bay.
Yeah, makes sense. So we're here with Daniel Flick, and we're going to talk a little bit more about free agency. Obviously, the Falcons have to get that quarterback situation figured out before some of the other pieces of the puzzle can get filled in. But as we mentioned before, Daniel called a shot last year with Jesse Bates. We'll continue this conversation here on Locked On Falcons and see if we can get him to call any other shots on any sort of free agents that are on his radar. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of the first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. So continuing here with Daniel Flick of Fan Nation, the SI Media Group. As I said last year, about 3 weeks ahead of free agency, we had you on talking about some East-West Shrine guys and, making some big, bold predictions about free agency. And, you called your shot on the Jesse Bates. So, anybody you're going to call your shots on today on Locked On Falcons?
Yeah, I don't feel as convicted as I did last year. I will say that I don't feel as convicted about it. We've talked a lot about Kirk Cousins. That would kind of be the lean there. But again, I don't feel as confident in that as I did last year. I felt really good about Jesse Bates last year from what I knew from the fit that was there. I think this year, the interesting name that I kind of keep coming back to is Jordan Fuller, the Rams safety. Atlanta has a needed safety. Raheem Morris was so fond of Jordan Fuller in LA. I mean, everybody in that building was so fond of him. Great leader, very versatile safety, very reliable player for them, very productive player. I think that's the type of guy that, you bring him in, you let him play alongside Jesse Bates. That back end suddenly in Atlanta has so much talent, so much experience, so much leadership. That it really is an encouraging group back there. One of the Rams free agent linebacker, Christian Roseboom, I think has a very real chance of ending up in Atlanta. We'll see how that kind of plays out. But I think you look at Atlanta's linebacker core, you look at Anderson, Lamb, and Ellis, and kind of see the need for a number 4, potentially number 5. Roseboom, to me, high-level special teams player, very good linebacker for that kind of, 4th or 5th role, wherever you want to put him. So I think he'd be a guy that I'd watch out for. You kind of start thinking about some of the other names that have been thrown out there. It's such a good safety class in general. I don't really think Atlanta touches the higher level. There's really no need to really start throwing out big money for a second safety after you just threw it out last year. So I don't think that, it's fun to talk about the idea of bringing in like a Simmons who just got released from the Broncos. He's a fantastic player, but I don't think that's a guy Atlanta would, why would you invest $100+ million in a safety tandem, right? So that's certainly something I would think they'd heavily consider. I think pass rush would be a very interesting option. You got a lot of talented players. I think about Jonathan Grenard in Houston, high-level player. That's kind of more of a thing of I look at fit and I look at the way that he played last year. And that's kind of an option for me that I think, hey, that could be on the radar. But again, I think really this is kind of that same spot we were in a couple years ago when Arthur Smith left Tennessee, and you're like, what Titans free agents could follow him? And then you see over the next few years, it's like, hey, a lot of those guys actually did. I look at LA. I think Fuller makes a lot of sense for Atlanta. And I think Roseboom as well.
Yeah, Fuller's been a guy I've had my name circled on. And once, I sort of had Taylor Rapp. It was like a trio of guys that have connections. Taylor Rapp, Jordan Fuller, Darnell Savage. And to me, it was just kind of be a conversation of, how exactly they would stack it, who's looking for what type of price. And then Rapp just got re-signed by the Bills. And I know Savage is a very talented player, but he's kind of have been up and down in Green Bay. And Jordan Fuller, as you mentioned, is just kind of solid. He's just rock solid, high character guy. He called the defense, and sort of it makes a lot of sense if you're the Falcons having another guy back there that has that experience, in the event that a Jesse Bates goes down or something like that, but someone along those lines. So Jordan Fuller. So I agree with you. While it would be fun to look at guys like Justin Simmons and Eddie Jackson and Kevin Byard and all those guys, but I don't think the Falcons necessarily need a 30-year-old safety at this point in time, just because you have Jesse Bates in the building and it's kind of his room. And so you just need another sort of talented young guy that you can hopefully pair with him for, multiple years, as opposed to one of these 30-year-old guys that you're kind of just renting for a year or two as they sort of, do what they do and play at a high level. So other position I'm curious about in the secondary is the cornerback position. Do you feel like the Falcons are going to sign that number 2 corner in free agency, or is that something that you think could wait till the draft?
Yeah, it's interesting. In Indy, a lot of the top corners had met with Atlanta while they were there. And so to me, you start looking at things, you can tell it's a position that they emphasize because it's not like they met with every top guy at every top position. So, to me, I thought it was interesting seeing guys like you think about Wiggins from Clemson, who's kind of in that mid to late round 1 part. You think about Lassiter from Georgia, who's more that round 2 type of guy. I kind of think they wait for the draft on corner. The conundrum that you find yourself in there is what kind of contract you're going to hand out to AJ Terrell, right? And from the sounds of it, I think Atlanta ends up handing out something this offseason, I would imagine, in the next few months. That's probably, I would imagine, that kind of like 15, probably around that number, right? And so it's kind of that same conversation as safety, is how much you really want to invest back there. Then you factor in that you do have Jesse Bates out there making 17 million, I believe, or 15 million. It was 64.5 over 4. So whatever the number is, I'm not good at math, but that number. And then you factor in Fuller making however many he's going to make potentially in this hypothetical. And then you factor in Terrell's contract. I think they wait for the draft, try to add a quality young option opposite Terrell, all the while knowing that you've got Clark Phillips, who played very serviceably outside in his 4 or 5 opportunities last year at the end of the season. And then you factor in that you got Alford coming back inside as well. It would be a young group, at least at corner, but you'd have that experienced guy in Terrell and then an experienced back end if they pursue the route that, we're kind of expecting them to at safety, to where I think you could probably make it work out there. So I would lean draft. I think that probably that second day, as of right now, I think that's probably very favorable for them to try to address that corner spot.
Yeah, it makes sense. Another position I'm curious to pick your brain on is the wide receiver group. And that's a group that probably going to get a complete overhaul. You could see, 4 or 5 additions this offseason to sort of join Drake London in that room. Is there anybody that you think is or should be on the Falcons' radar, at least in free agency?
I think Tyler Boyd would be a fun fit in Atlanta, just in that hypothetical. If you can find a way to land Tyler Boyd, be great. Again, a steady, proven, productive player, inside, outside, can be whatever you need him to be. I still think the conundrum that Atlanta's found itself in so many times the last few years, especially under Arthur Smith, is trying to chase that speed only guy while you have another number 2 who's so much like your number 1. You just got to find somebody who can stretch the field. So, there are options like that. I think about a Hollywood Brown, who's obviously battled some inconsistency, but his speed's the type of guy that you would like to add into that room. I think about Samuel from Washington, who that versatility, I think, is very intriguing. I think Zach Robinson would have a lot of fun if you were to add a guy like Samuel. And again, Atlanta's offense has a pretty solid trio of playmakers in there already. You just got to start finding, if you can add a serviceable number 2, a proven. That's why I think Tyler Boyd, and however you want to find a way to use him, however you can make that work, I think it'd be a fun fit. I think his nuance, his experience, again, he's just steady. And Atlanta, with so many young playmakers, and last year you could see the role varying each week and the numbers varying each week. You know what you're getting in Tyler Boyd. I think that'd be a very fun fit. Now, obviously, Atlanta tapped into that Cincinnati well last year. We'll see if they do it again this year.
Yeah. Well, you're not going to get any complaints about Tyler Boyd joining the Falcons here because he's a Pitt legend. And anybody who knows me knows that I support the Pitt legends. But we'll move on from free agency and wrap things up here, talking a little bit about the draft and maybe pick Daniel's brain a little bit more on sort of the Jayden Daniels of it all. And we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, comedy, music, and theater near you. And they have killer last-minute deals. You buy tickets in seconds right up to the start of the event. All-in prices mean you're not going to get hit with hidden fees, and you can see the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. And don't forget Game Time's guarantee. That means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, they'll credit you 110% the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDON, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons here with Daniel Flick. We're recording this exactly 7 weeks away from the 2024 NFL draft. But, I know you've already mentioned Jayden Daniels as someone that you've heard that the Falcons are interested, at least in this quarterback class. So I'll just give you the floor and you can elaborate further on some of those things that you've heard in regards to the Falcons' interest in Jayden Daniels.
Yeah, that was the main thing that I heard from Indianapolis, from Atlanta's organization, just reading some things and hearing things around Indianapolis, is that he is a guy they're very, very fond of. There are some within that room who have him as their top quarterback. Again, they're still finalizing that. That's what Fontenot told us, and the local scrum in Indy, is that they're still working their way through that, and they will be working through that all the way up until the draft. He said you don't want to be watching film the day of, obviously, and they won't be, but they're going to be tweaking that all the way through. But again, off of their meetings, off of their film, off of the entire fall and winter process so far, that they're very fond of Jayden Daniels. As we're now finding out, a lot of other teams are as well. And I think Washington would be a very interesting fit for him at 2. And then you start looking at Atlanta and Drake May, and that's one that I'm not so, I'm not certain on. I really have no idea where they're at with him. It's interesting, if Arthur Smith was still there, you'd have the UNC connection. Obviously, Yates was a UNC guy, so I know that May was fond of that meeting because they had that connection. But again, this is where, like, as you mentioned, we're 7 weeks out. It's so tricky now because they could sign Kirk Cousins in a week and this whole conversation is just mute, right? But again, for now, I tend to think that you look at Jayden, you look at what he does with his legs, you look at the way that he can improvise, and the accuracy that he had last year. Obviously phenomenal runner as well. A lot of people talk about his frame. He missed 1 game in college. Very good leader. You've heard you've heard Atlanta's regime mention all off seasons about the person. I've heard glowing reviews about Jayden Daniels as a person. His leadership style, very, very personable, tries to create these strong relationships with each guy. He's not one of those, rah-rah guys per se. He's just a guy that's there and cares. And again, I think that's the type of person Atlanta wants, and I think he's got the talent to be the type of guy Atlanta would want as well. Then you kind of start thinking about other options at quarterback. What happens if they miss on him? If in the hypothetical where they don't, and again, this is why I think they end up landing somebody in free agency or via trade if it comes to that, and they don't end up entering the draft needing that. But I think if it's in the situation where they do need a quarterback, that's where they start to get very desperate trying to move up. It seems like New England would be content having a bridge option there, to where you would think that maybe they'd be more willing to move down. Maybe they wouldn't need to select a quarterback at 3. That's kind of the spot where it feels like they will, but they also aren't as all in as, say, a Washington is right now, And so, but again, if Atlanta has its quarterback position solved up, which I may be stepping into something else you want to talk about now, I think a trade down is very feasible for Atlanta. Try to tap into that cornerback class that potentially, somewhere in that middle of the teens would be an interesting option. I still think pass rusher at 8 is probably where they would ultimately lean right now. I think Turner from Alabama is really an intriguing fit there if he gets to 8, just his athleticism, his profile. You saw what I think it was Byron Young was able to put on film for LA last year, and he had 8 or 9 sacks his rookie year as a 3rd round pick. The twitch that he had was really, really paramount in that. I think Turner would be phenomenal under Raheem Morris. And so I think if quarterback's off the table there, if they have that position locked up, I would look first at outside linebacker, that edge group. I think receiver is a very sneaky option there. I personally, as I was talking earlier with that speed threat, Malik Neighbors, I think would be a very phenomenal fit in Atlanta.
Yeah. If I had to pick who are my favorite prospects, not saying that they're the best prospects, but in terms of just is Caleb Williams and Malik Neighbors are my two favorite prospects in this draft class. And so if the Falcons land Malik Neighbors, I'm doing backflips on the live show on draft night and probably breaking my neck and spending that night celebrating in the hospital. But yeah, I do think, especially in a world where, you know, you do solve that quarterback situation in March, who, regardless of whether it's Kirk Cousins or Justin Fields or somebody else, you know, putting weapons around that guy in order to maximize whatever window that guy has, whether it's, you know, a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever, makes a ton of sense. And someone like Malik Neighbors or Roma Dunze totally makes sense at 8, given how highly regarded those guys are. But, you know, this is a deep wide receiver class, so there will be opportunities later in the draft to get some talent there. It's not as deep at edge, and I think that's going to impact some of the decisions that they make, particularly early in the draft, as well as in free agency, because you might want to stock up in free agency because you won't, the talent that's going to be there probably in the middle rounds that normally you could just, you know, add bodies there. You may not be necessarily looking at that. But, you know, who are some of the players, you know, I've talked about some of my favorites. Who are some of the players that so far in this process that you sort of look at and you say, I really like this guy and I think he would be a great pick for Atlanta?
Yeah, you know, for me, one of the guys in Indy that I loved watching, the running back from the University of Texas, Keelan Robinson. Atlanta, I don't think would draft a second Robinson from Texas back-to-back years. But again, if we're just talking about my guys, purely my guys, he was a guy that I loved early on at Alabama, just because he would come in those blowouts and he was just the fastest player on the field. And then you're kind of watching him move around in Indy, and he's so fluid, so athletic, so twitchy. That was one of the guys for me that I thoroughly enjoyed watching there. I have a little bit of a tie with it's a little Michael Penix connection for me. He's got a little soft spot, you know, in my heart. I personally am a left-handed athlete, though athlete's a very loose term for that. And watching him, you know, throw as well as he does, throw with as much velocity as he does, I'm a big fan of Michael Penix. Those types of guys for me who overcome so much throughout their college careers, I'm just a really big fan of. And then I kind of want to stick on that offensive side of the ball. Malik Washington from Virginia, being able to talk with him in Indy and learn more about him. Undersized guy, slot guy, but athletic, returner, quick. Got to talk with him a little bit about he's from the state of Georgia, I believe Marietta, and we talked a little bit about playing at home and what he would you know, I guess like what that would mean for him. And he talked a lot about wanting to start up like a youth group and a local like volunteer organization and trying to help underprivileged youth. And that's such a unique answer. I've never heard anybody, I've never at a combine podium heard a player talk about that. And for me, that was one thing that just really stuck with me. And you can learn a lot about people in those settings. You can learn very little about people in those settings. And I thought that Malik Washington, considering that was entirely, he had no idea I was asking that. He had no idea that he was going to step up and talk about that. You could tell it was something that he, you know, had thought about and would like to pursue. And I thought that was a really neat thing to see a college guy step up there and say like, hey, I want to give back.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, I appreciate your input on free agency, the quarterback conversation, as well as the draft, and we'll sort of see what develops next week. It's going to be a very busy week for all of us covering the Falcons. The takes will be flying hot and fresh, but let the people know where they can find your stuff and what you got in store for them in the coming days and weeks.
Sure. Twitter at @ByDanielFlick. That'll be all my live updates from free agency. That'll be a busy week for my fingers. And then also a busy week for my fingers. SI.com/NFL/Falcons. That will be where I write all my recaps, all my news stories, all my analysis on things. Should have a pretty big story dropping here in a few days, probably this weekend, about the inner makings of Raheem Morris's staff, his conversation with those guys, how they settled on who they settled on. I'm excited to watch that kind of come together. And then here in a few weeks, NFL owners meetings could be out there. We'll see. We're still working through some things there, but yeah, could have a chance to have some live footage, live coverage there for everybody who follows me at @ByDanielFlick. So Aaron, as always, really appreciate you. Hopefully it's not another year till I'm back on, but if it is, hopefully I get another year of basking in the glory of my accurate take.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. I will do my best to get you on, not wait a full year. I always say that to all my guests, and then I don't do a good job of it. That's on me, guys. That's not on me. But Daniel, really, again, appreciate you for joining us on today's Locked On Falcons, and look forward to reading all your stuff. He's one of the best people out there covering the Atlanta Falcons. And when he drops a story, I usually go, let me check out what D Flick has going on in these stories. So yeah, guys, definitely check that out at si.com. So appreciate you. We'll be back with more next week. Busy week.